the policy discourse in Syria's neighboring countries has shifted from one focused on reception to return. Amid an increasingly securitized policy climate, displaced Syrians in Turkey and Lebanon have seen their livelihoods and rights deteriorate. At the same time, several surveys show that though Syrians want to return, they do not currently perceive the Syrian context as conducive to return. In those surveys, they have expressed concerns over military conscription, lack of shelter, and the fear of reprisal under the Assad regime. In this presentation, I would like to focus on the case of Syrian refugee return in Lebanon, with the aim of providing broader insights into how refugee rights are negotiated in spaces of ambiguity and fragmentation. I analyze the context in which Lebanon's governing actors, namely government agencies, political parties, and representatives of local communities, have started pushing for a politics of refugee return since 2016. At the same time, I show how, despite a prevailing consensus that Syrian refugees ought to return, Lebanese actors have clashed on how this politics is to look like, turning it into a key site of contention. I argue that various actors have drawn on the politics of return as a balance of power game. More specifically, they have used it as a bargaining leverage for deriving geopolitical gains in the context of Syria's conflict and for acquiring popularity in Lebanon's divided politics. So my presentation will unpack the following questions. How have some of Lebanon's key governance actors cooperated and clashed on return? How have they capitalized on the politics of return to maximize their gains? And last, how have their fragmented agendas paradoxically served the authority of the state? I proceed as follows. First, I map the proliferation of key governance actors involved in the making of refugee return initiatives. Second, I explore their conflicting preferences over the politics of refugee return. Then, I turn to the motives underpinning their role in refugee return and show how these motives are rooted in more imaginaries and relationships of power. In addition to media analysis, my presentation relies on interviews with key Lebanese political parties. So Lebanese politics rests on a complex system of sectarian power sharing in which Christian and Muslim communities have divided political offices. As you might know, right now unprecedented protests are currently taking place with a view to dismantling the sectarian-based model of politics. So the small state of 4 million inhabitants has taken in more than 1 million Syrian refugees, though it's non-signatory to the Refugee Convention. Here, it's worth noting that Lebanon's refugee regime does not embody a unified or system-wide set of policies. Rather, it is the outcome of a fluid interplay between various formal and informal structures. Formally, Lebanon signed a memorandum of understanding with the UNHCR, allowing it to register refugees. In practice, however, politicians have framed refugees as a matter of geopolitics and have historically framed them as a threat to the demographic balance of power. So at the outset of the Syrian conflict, the Lebanese government adopted an open border policy. By 2015, it closed its borders. However, 8 years into Syria's conflict, the Lebanese government has started calling for the rash return of Syrian refugees, framing them as a very difficult burden. In this context, various state and non-state actors have put in place multiple initiatives for refugee return. So Lebanon's key governance actors may agree today that displaced Syrians should return. Still, they have proposed and implemented various return initiatives that it has almost become impossible to determine a site of focal decision-making. So to begin with, the Lebanese state has created an official channel for Syrians to apply for voluntary returns. This channel is coordinated by the General Security Offices. 17 registration centers allow Syrians to apply for return pending that the Syrian government decides on their applications. In parallel, Some political parties that are close to the Syrian regime have devised informal committees to incentivize return registration and process applications. For instance, drawing on its close connections with the Syrian regime, Hezbollah established last year a return program with contact centers and task forces. That same year, the Free Patriotic movement, At-Tayar al-Hur, Lebanon's largest Christian party, established a committee to facilitate return to Syria's so-called safe areas. Key communal actors such as religious authorities have also played a major role in legitimizing those return initiatives. For example, Lebanon's Supreme Islamic Shia Council has framed the return of rights as a sacred right. The Maronite Christian Church called on the displaced to return home as they constitute a threat to Lebanon's identity. So in this context, civil society activists have criticized such initiatives on the basis that they violate norms of voluntary repatriation in safety and dignity. Some Lebanese ministries have also deplored the multitude of return initiatives, calling on the Council of Ministers to become the focal authority on return. Still, the Council has abstained from developing a policy frame, delegating instead return to Lebanon's security agencies. At the heart of this deadlock and fragmentation are key governance actors' conflicting preferences of what this politics of refugee return is to look like. As many of you know, Lebanon's relationship with the Syrian regime has been one of the most polarizing issues in Lebanon's post-war order. For more than a decade, Lebanon's governance actors have been divided into two major coalitions called the pro-Syrian and anti-Syrian coalitions. At the heart of this division is whether Lebanon is to coordinate closely with the Syrian regime on geopolitical matters or to distance itself from such a course. So according to my field research, pro-Assad and anti-Assad actors in Lebanon are particularly in disagreement over the following issues: Lebanon's relationship with the Syrian regime, the identity of actors Lebanon is set to coordinate with on the question of return, the conditions and temporalities underlying Syrian refugee return, and Lebanon's position towards international actors funding refugee stay in Lebanon. In a nutshell, parties aligned with the Syrian regime in Lebanon, such as the Shia party Hezbollah or the Christian party, the Free Patriotic Current, have called on the Lebanese government to normalize its ties with the Syrian regime to facilitate refugee returns. Some of my interviewees argued that although they are not refusing some externally sponsored refugee return initiatives such as the Russian initiative, they consider the Syrian regime to be the main authority that can provide security assurances for returning refugees. Such parties want to separate refugee return from the prerequisite of a political solution, drawing attention to the existence of regime-held safe areas. Generally speaking, they have called on the international community, namely the EU and the UNHCR, to stop investing money in refugee stay and to divert instead funds from Lebanon to Syria. Conversely, Lebanon's anti-Syrian parties, such as the Sunni-led party called the Future Current, have fiercely opposed the normalization of ties with the Syrian regime as long as a political solution was not in sight. Though they would like to see the refugees return, they have doubted the narrative that conditions in Syria are ripe for return. Moreover, they have aligned their stances with with the international communities or Western powers' position on return and have courted international powers seeking to provide refugee aid in Lebanon. So the question that arises is, what is at stake here? And what motives drive these competing preferences over refugee return? Why has Lebanon's Council of Ministers abstained from developing a policy frame, even though all key political executives have called for rash repatriation? And why have some political parties informally established return initiatives that have no legal anchor? I argue in my research that the file of refugee return cannot be separated from Lebanese actors' history of tensions with the Syrian regime and war imaginaries in the shadow of Syria's conflict. In such imaginary constructs, I show that the politics of Syrian refugee return has become closely tied to the imagined fate of post-conflict Syria, and how rival politicians may use refugee return as a strategic avenue to secure their interests derive potential payoffs, and deploy authority. Very briefly, since 2011, Syria's war has provided Lebanese actors with a major opportunity to leverage not only its onset, but also its potential ending for their own interests. Pro-Syrian parties in Lebanon that rely on strategic and financial leverage facilitated by the Syrian regime have sided from the outset of Syria's war with the Assad regime. By 2016, as the Assad regime had regained control over most of Syria's territory, these parties have emerged as key domestic players on the ground, partly because of their steady alliance with the Bashar al-Assad regime. Conversely, parties that are aligned with the anti-Syrian alliance in Lebanon have capitalized on the onset of Syria's uprising as an opportunity for weakening the Assad regime and its allies in Lebanon and regionally. Yet, with the advances of the Syrian government forces, the anti-Syrian alliance emerged as a weak coalition, both domestically and regionally. Its leader, the Sunni Future movement that has supported Syria's opposition, has suffered significant losses of popularity. Within this climate, the refugee return file evolved into an opportunity that Lebanon's players could use to take power from each other. I will give some concrete examples before I close. First, Lebanese factions have used bargaining over the Syrian return issue as an avenue for forming favorable alliances and preemptively ensuring certain payoffs. So as I said, parties that side with the Syrian regime perceive coordination with the Syrian regime on refugee return as a twofold strategy. First, it would help them to consolidate their existing strategic alliances and expect rewards once a peace deal is secured in Syria. Second, it would allow them to rehabilitate the contested legitimacy of their staunch ally. By organizing returns, they promote the narrative of a stabilized Syria. In contrast, anti-Syrian factions that have suffered losses in the light of the Assad regime's victory draw on the file of refugee return as a bargaining space through which they may still offset some of these losses and, better yet, derive some future gains. For instance, by seeking to align their stances with Western powers such as the EU on the principle of safe and dignified return, anti-Syrian parties seek to compensate for their declining political leverage on the Lebanese scene. So the Sunni Future Current has shown unrelenting support for the EU's strategy of refugee reception in Syria's neighboring countries. This strategy has enabled it to curate its international alliances, notwithstanding its declining power in Lebanon. Second, Lebanon's key governance actors have used the file of refugee return as a platform for cementing their sectarian power, especially in competitive electoral contexts. By calling for the return of Syrian refugees who are mostly Sunni, political parties and religious authorities have branded themselves as the gatekeepers of Lebanon's power-sharing balance between Christians and Muslims. Thirdly, some Lebanese governance actors who have emerged as triumphant domestic powers in the light of Assad's victory have drawn on refugee return to brand themselves as security managers and as mediators in times of crises. So, as perhaps many of you know, in 2017, following its victory over Islamist groups from Syria, Hezbollah negotiated on its own the return of more than 50 Syrian families without the Lebanese government's oversight. 1 year later, the party opened a return program in Lebanon, declaring its willingness to capitalize on its connections and power base within Lebanon and Syria to return refugees. By overseeing the flow of goods and people, Hezbollah certainly pursues a broader security agenda. At the same time, it casts itself as a problem solver that is ready to help until the Lebanese state solves the contentious matter of refugee return. How does this fragmentation and proliferation of return initiatives serve the Lebanese state authority? I argue in my research that informality and fragmentation bring benefits to the Lebanese refugee hosting state, in contrast to many works that portray the Lebanese state as weak and disengaged. Let me give you an example. By shifting governance away from central state institutions, such as the Parliament and the Council of Ministers, the state seeks to evade pressures to to craft a refugee repatriation plan. As a result of fragmentation, international actors such as the UNHCR have found it hard to coordinate with one representative authority. At the same time, the Lebanese state has deliberately shied away from adopting an official position on return, outsourcing the task of refugee return to a variety of formal and informal actors obscures accountability. Here, it's not possible to assign blame to one institutional entity. I reach my concluding remarks. I looked at Lebanon's conflicting refugee return initiatives. I have also analyzed how these agendas are to be read in the context of complex relationships of power and competing war imaginaries in which contending domestic actors wrestle over tangible and symbolic gains. I have moreover attracted attention to how fragmentation over return politics has served the state's logic. I hope I have contributed here to the development of a broader case study that illustrates more broadly and more generally how responses to displacement on the ground are often shaped in spaces of liminality, informality, and ambiguity, and hybridity as well, at the expense of rights-based norms. Thank you so much.